Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you all to this webinar, The War in Ukraine, International Geopolitical and Geo-Economic Consequences, organized by Emirates Policy Center to discuss the fallout of the conflict on the international order and the geopolitical and geo-economic situation in the world. The world is still following the course of the Ukraine war, which started on February 24, 2022. This war represents the peak of the crisis between Russia and the West since Moscow annexed Crimea in March 2014. Then came the escalation between the two sides when Russia started its military buildup in November 2021 along its border with Ukraine. This was followed by the American-Russian dispute over the security guarantees that Moscow asked for in January 2022. On February 21, 2022, the Russian president decided to recognize the independence of the separate regions of Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine. The world still awaits the entire outcome of this war, which will not be limited to Ukraine and Russia. Instead, it will have consequences across Europe, which faces one of the worst conflicts of this scale since World War II. The ramifications of this conflict are bound to have geostrategic, political, security, military, and economic dimensions. Not surprisingly, several officials and analysts have said that the world is now passing through a decisive moment in its history. And we are at the threshold of new world order. These analysts even warn of the conflict going nuclear. Let's first look at the pre-elementary consequences of the war in Ukraine. The Russian-Western polarization reminds us of the Cold War at the political level. At the security level, it's about NATO's unity and the indifference of Finland and Sweden to join this military alliance. At the economic level, it is about the unprecedented sanctions imposed on Russia, I could say embargo on Russia, and even the sharp increase in energy prices. These ramifications are likely to expand in the next phase and have a long-term impact. I don't want to go into details of these issues at stake, and we'll leave them for discussions in the webinar, which deals with three major themes. The first theme is the likely scenarios for the war in Ukraine, the objective and the stakes of the key actors, Russia, Ukraine, Europe, and the US in dealing with the war crisis. The second theme tackles implications of the war in EU and NATO, Russia, the impact of this war on the future of US strategy towards Russia, the Russian-Chinese rapprochement, and the impact of the outcomes of this war on the international order. The third theme is the consequences of the war in Ukraine on the global economy and the geopolitical landscape of energy. To discuss these themes, we are honored to have a panel of renowned experts and researchers with us in this webinar. We have with us Dr. Andrei Kortunov, who is the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. He is a reputed expert in Russian foreign policy and global contemporary international relations. We have also Mr. Cliff Kopchan, the chairman of the Eurasia Group and a renowned expert in Russian policy. Dr. Stephen Meyer, is the director of Executive Board of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. He is an expert in EU and German security and foreign policy. We also have with us Dr. Hani Findakli, Vice Chairman of the Clinton Group in New York and an international expert on political economy, investment, and development. I want to welcome all of our speakers today and thank them for accepting our invitation to participate in this event. I would also like to welcome the audience who have joined us via Zoom. The webinar is also live streaming on EPC's various social media platforms and its YouTube channel. Before I give the floor to speakers, I would like to inform our Arab viewers that they can listen to the Arabic interpretation of the discussion by clicking on the French channel down the screen. Let us now proceed with the webinar and the question of the webinar. I will address this question to Dr. Kortonov. Dr. Kortonov, I would like to ask you about Russia's objectives and stakes in Ukraine war. To what extent are these objectives attainable through war or the ongoing talks between Moscow and Kiev? Are these objectives limited to Ukraine, or is Moscow looking beyond Ukraine? Dr. Kortonov, floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Kalbi, for inviting me to take part in this important and very timely event. I hope that we will have time to discuss the implications of the current crisis on the situation in the MENA region, because the implications are manifold and I think quite important. But let me start with making a confession. You presented me as an expert on Russian foreign policy and international relations, but in the spirit of full disclosure, I have to say that I didn't predict what happened on February 24th. Like many of my colleagues in Moscow, I believed that that wouldn't happen, that the accumulation of Russian forces on the border with Ukraine was a means of deterrence and also a means of getting attention from the West to make sure that the West takes Russian complaints and grievances in a serious way. I turned out to be wrong, like many of us, and now we have to face the consequences. Now, responding to the question that you raised, I have to say that the Russian agenda seems to be quite clear, though it is an open question to what extent this agenda is realistic. First of all, the Kremlin doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO. It's crystal clear. Moreover, it doesn't want Ukraine to host any significant NATO infrastructure on its territory. Because one of the concerns that Moscow had was that Ukraine, even without being accepted as a full-fledged member of the first of all, the Kremlin doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO to Moscow if it's crystal clear. Moreover, it doesn't want Ukraine to NATO weapons. The second significant demand NATO infrastructure on its territory. Because one of the what they describe as demilitarization of Ukraine. It implies that Ukraine should refrain from any actions or military postures that can present a challenge to the Russian Federation. And this is exactly what Russia is doing right now by the use of military means. It is disarming Ukraine, so to say, by destroying the military infrastructure of this country. And finally, the last, but probably the least clear demand that Russia has is what they call in the Russian government the denazification of Ukraine. And many interpret this term as a demand to reload the Ukrainian state project by marginalizing or excluding the far right, the most radical nationalistic forces, which play a significant role in Ukraine today. So these are the red lines, and we understand. And by the way, I should also mention there are other demands related to the changes in the in the territorial status of the Crimean Peninsula and of the Donetsk and Lugansk republics. The Kremlin apparently demands that Ukraine should recognize Crimea as a part of the Russian Federation and these two republics as independent states in their own right. So it is clear that Ukraine cannot accept such demands, and Ukraine has its own list of demands to Russia, which will tell you how far the two sides are from each other. The Kremlin apparently demands that Ukraine an interim ceasefire. First, Ukraine wants all the Russian troops out of Ukraine, and also to have a de-escalation on the Russian-Ukrainian border, so Ukraine would never be or would not be threatened by Russia directly. Second, Ukraine wants Russia to recall its diplomatic recognition of the two breakaway republics in the east. It wants to get the Crimean Peninsula back to Ukraine. And finally, it wants Russia to pay reparations for the damage that has already been inflicted during this conflict. So these are two sets of demands, and it is very difficult to reconcile the two. I think that a lot will depend on how the conflict evolves. Two issues are of particular importance. Two independent variables are at play here. First of all, the resilience of the Ukrainian resistance. That might be a game changer. If Ukraine is able to resist the Russian pressure, it might force Russia to modify or to change its demands. And second, of course, the impact of sanctions. It might be delayed in time, and not all of the sanctions will have a direct impact on the Russian economy tomorrow, but these sanctions are clearly beyond everything that we have seen so far, and definitely sanctions will bite, and the odds are that we will see more sanctions in the pipeline. So this is the situation today. We had 2 rounds of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. The third round is supposed to take place today. The two sides agreed only to provide for humanitarian corridors for inhabitants of large Ukrainian cities, which might become a battlefield. But even these agreements are not working efficiently enough. Both sides accuse each other of obstructing the outflow of the civilian population from large cities. And I think that if we're able to accomplish this goal, that would already be a major accomplishment for the time being. Thank you.
Before I go to Cliff, just one point I want to ask you, Andrei, that Putin was not expected this Ukrainian resistance or resilience. He did not expect that much of sanctions, which I call it, it's more than sanctions, it's embargo.
Well, I think that it's an interesting question. I think that a lot will depend on whether the West is able to make this system of economic sanctions universal. To what extent other countries, especially non-Western countries, are likely to get along with the Western sanctions. by initiating what you rightly called an economic blockade of Moscow. But let me also say that, in my opinion, even if it is not possible, even if there is no complete economic isolation of Moscow at this juncture, the West will definitely try to find alternative sources of the commodities that it now gets from Russia. So the Russian share of global markets is likely to shrink, and the sources of the currency that the Russian leadership has at its disposal are likely to plummet. So I think that it definitely has very significant long-term implications for the Russian economy. And the only explanation I have for the actions taken by the Russian Federation is that the Kremlin leadership apparently believes that Ukraine in its current political format constitutes a formidable threat not only to Russia's security, but to Russia's existence as a sovereign state. That's the only explanation I have for the actions that have been taken by Moscow.
Thank you, Dr. Kortanov. Cliff, how valid the idea that the West, notably the US, created this crisis and pushed Putin towards war because it was first Lenin with President Zelensky regarding not implementing the Minsk II agreement. The West and the US did not respond to Moscow's national security concerns and did not give the security guarantees President Putin asked for. On the other hand, how does the West and the US view Putin? Do they see him as a rational actor in this crisis?
Well, first, thank you again for including me in this event. Like Andre, I thought there'd be a small war. I didn't expect anything like this. I didn't get it right either. I think to begin to answer that question, I should say right up front that the view in this country is one of shock, just utter shock at what's going on. That the degree of violence, the degree of shelling of civilians has this country, and I can leave the Europeans to speak for Europe, but I think the West is simply appalled, just appalled. And there's no excuse for it. If there were mistakes made by the West, and I think there were, that doesn't even begin to explain what the Russian government has done here. So I think any academic discourse or analysis has to begin with there is no way this can happen, period. To begin to answer the question then, which is a reasonable question. I do, in my own view, the West could have handled the issue of post-Soviet Central and Eastern Europe differently. I don't think it's rocket science or advanced political science theory that rubbing the nose of the defeated in ways that may not be necessary is a strategy that may have been a bit short on thoughtfulness. I have never been a huge fan of NATO enlargement, but that puts me in the distinct minority in this country. The view of Mr. Putin, I think, again, I don't like to personalize this on Putin. I think that this is a Russian government that has done something that is just really, really bad. I do think from the limited exposure I've had to the Russian president, he seems different. Sure, he seems different now than he did before the crisis. Much more inward directed, much more just full of anger towards Ukraine, and that's very evident. So, in my own personal view, there's something different, but I don't know the man. I don't really know what's going on. And it doesn't really matter because it's the policy that really matters. Let me just, as long as I have the floor, briefly respond to a few things that, Andre, I've known Andre for 30 years. He's as smart as they come. So let me, or maybe smarter. So let me say that at the outset. But I would add, Andre, that in fairness, denazification means Zelensky has to go. That is the democratically elected, overwhelmingly democratically elected president of Ukraine has to go. Secondly, if I could just share the thought that I think these are the central bank sanctions to export sanctions to long-term energy sanctions. The ruble is about half, 60 to 137. The most crushing sanctions. I worked on Iran. I wrote Iran sanctions when I was younger on the Hill. These are the most crushing, widespread sanctions that I've seen. I've almost lost my breath at times to see the degree of Western cohesion. Germany led by putting Nord Stream on the shelf. That's just nothing short of astounding. I mean, Joe Biden, who I've been critical of, deserves a straight A for this policy. The final thing that I will say, just to get it out there, I know I'm talking a little more than you asked me to, give me another 30 seconds, is that I really worry about what we're in here now, I think that this is as dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis, maybe more. And let me just take 10 seconds to explain why. I think there's going to be a frozen conflict. I think the Ukraine-Poland border is going to become very dangerous. And I fear NATO-Russian aerial engagement around that border. And I fear NATO-Russian combat on the ground along that border. And that is very escalatory. So let me stop there, but I'm sure we'll have more to say.
Well, I think, Cliff, that was miscalculation from both sides, from the Russian side and from the American side for the intention of both. I mean, I think the American did not, or they did not expect that the Russian will went that way in Ukraine, and the Russian did not expect that the type of sanction. It's a blockade, I would say, more than sanctions. And to tell you the truth, any sanction did not succeed to change anything. Look to the sanction against Iran, against Saddam Hussein. It did not change anything. I will move to Dr. Meyer. Dr. Meyer, what are the Europe objectives and stakes in the Ukrainian crisis? Do the Europeans see the possibility of a political solution in Ukraine? What are the characteristics of such solution?
Yeah, thank you very much also for having me. And I think it's very difficult to see a political solution to the present crisis because, as Andrei Kortunov rightly emphasized, the positions of the Ukrainian government and the Russian government differ that much that it's really, from our point of view, difficult to see what a solution might be. But perhaps coming back to the European position, and I must say that in the beginning of the crisis, Europe seemed to be split on this issue. We had certainly a very intensive discussion between the Baltic and the Middle Eastern European states and the Western states, including Germany, how to deal with the crisis and what to expect from Putin. But one of the achievements, so to speak, of Putin was to unify Europe and European Union more than ever on this issue. And I think the main objective, the overarching objective, is clearly to preserve the European security order as we see it defined since the end of the Cold War, which has, from our point of view, two crucial elements. First, that borders can't be changed by military force. And secondly, that every nation has the right to choose its own alliance. And this is precisely, I think, what was running against Putin's considerations, especially with regard to Ukraine. Andrei Kortunov already referred to it, that Ukraine not joining NATO was one of the immediate demands by Putin. And from our point of view, this is a clear undermining of the European security order, as we also have defined it in a Charter of Paris and in the Budapest Memorandum. So the immediate objective of the European Union right now is, of course, to increase the economic pressure on Russia, to support Ukraine in defending itself, but also, and I would strongly emphasize this, despite what Cliff Kupchan said, not to get militarily involved in this conflict. We all know that the escalation potential is huge. We have discussions with the Polish government on the delivery of military aircrafts, which, from my point of view, would really get us even higher on the escalation spiral. So we have to be very careful in Europe and on NATO not to get militarily involved. There is the risk, but I would clearly say that at least the German government would do everything to avoid that.
It was historically tried to avoid what even since the Soviet Union, to avoid whatever coming from that part, but it seems it couldn't stop at the end that what happened is happened. But I don't know if what's the Europe position can help Ukraine or can help solve the problem, as I said, with the cliff. The sanctions takes ages and it might not succeed to change anything on the ground, or even if we are talking about regime change.
I think that the sanctions will have impact. I think different from many other countries, Russia's economy is very much interlinked with the global economy. Very much depends on energy and raw materials exports, especially to Europe. And of course, there will be huge economic damage on the Russian economy. And it will be, difficult to predict, but we certainly will see some effects also on the society and perhaps also in the political field. I think they will have a very strong impact. But let me just comment on the miscalculations, which also already played a role. And this, I think, is the central problem, that we had miscalculations on both sides. As Andrei Kortunov didn't expect Putin to invade Ukraine, I think there were hardly any people who believed it here in Europe. We even had some strong doubts, as the Americans told us, that Putin would do so. So we thought that Putin is as you refer to, a quite rational actor, which acts in a opportunistic way. That means that he uses any kind of weaknesses we show, and that he would try to put pressure on European Union to accept his demands. But he wouldn't go that far to try to push through his demands by military means. And I think Putin, on the other hand, miscalculated both the strong resistance he might meet from the Ukrainians, but also that the West, especially the European Union, would be unified in its position. And I think we have these kind of miscalculations on both sides. And it's very difficult really to get out of this situation right now.
Thank you, Dr. Meyer. Dr. Van Dagli, I know you are an economist, but also I think you have a wide perspective on geopolitics. So allow me, please, to ask you about the likely scenarios of the Ukrainian crisis, because you understand American politics. Do you think it is in Washington's interest to stop the war and push for a political settlement, or does the US seek to transform Ukraine into Russia's Afghanistan? You are muted, Dr. Van Dagli.
My apology. You're right that I'm not an expert on this area of the world, and my assessment of the situation is that unlike previous times in which a U.S.-Russia confrontation has led to some kind of an ad hoc and temporary settlement. Minsk II is an example of that. But this time, the situation does not lend itself to a quick, a temporary solution, even if it weren't valuable to either side. From the U.S. perspective, I think everybody sort of slept walking into this conflict. Both sides had options to get out. I remind the audience that this is the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. During that time, there was a negotiation and there was backdoor discussion that resulted in both sides making a concession with Russia agreeing to, or Soviet Union agreeing to move out of Cuba, its missiles and weaponry in return for, and at that time it was a private agreement that was not made public until much later, maybe 15 years later, to withdraw its missiles out of Turkey. So both sides recognized the national interests of either side and acted accordingly, and that diffused the conflict because that was the last time that the world came very close to a nuclear confrontation. This kind of diplomacy did not work here. The question really is, I think everybody was surprised by the actions of Russia to invade Ukraine with the degree of military intervention that we currently have. But there is an old theory, game theory, about how the relationship between two parties evolve. And there's a concept in there about how to stabilize those things. And the stability of a conflict of this type is usually achieved when both sides anticipate and recognize what each side is doing. And this way, there's an element of predictability in this. The U.S. assumed that Russia has these red lines about the NATO expansion. It has, received several warnings in the last several years. The war in Georgia was an example. The limited intervention of the Ukraine in 2014 was another side, and it was very clear what Russia's red lines were. They had 14 times expansion of NATO since they offered and promised the then Soviet leaders and then ultimately Russian leaders that they would not expand NATO, and yet 14 countries joined NATO since then. So the Ukraine became a critical point in this conflict. The issue about the both sides knowing what's going on is that Russia, I think, anticipated sanctions. They've already been under sanctions, and therefore it was only a matter of how far they go. And they certainly, I agree with Dr. Kapchan. The extent of those sanctions are far severe than anything that the U.S. has done against any country. But they have anticipated that, I think, to some extent, maybe not to the extent it has been announced. They have done some preparatory and cautionary preparation for that. For example, Russia has very quietly been accumulating quite a bit of gold and tradable commodities reserves to a point now. They represent almost a quarter of the entire 630 billion foreign exchange reserves. They have also moved to diversify the rest of their foreign exchange reserves by also allocating about another quarter of their foreign exchange reserves into the Chinese RMB. So literally half of their entire 600 plus billion reserve have been shifted out of the reach of the United States extrajudicial application. The second thing they did, which was also important, is that they shifted their trade dependence from Europe to Russia. Sorry, to China. So they've entered into a number of long-term agreements, the last of which was done within the last month, that will lead to diverting quite a bit of the oil that Russia produces and gas that Russia produces themselves into China. By 2030, by my estimate, Russia will be selling to China about $700 billion. That's almost 40% of the entire Russian GDP to China, and that reduces its dependence on Europe. Dr. Kachin talked about Nord Stream 2 being, or Dr. Zumaya, Nord Stream 2 being, at least for the time being, suspended. So they have options, and they have developed some of those. To the extent that the rest of the sanctions are implementable, in my view, they will have, from an economic perspective, they will have an equally damaging impact on Russia as well as the US and Europe, although the damage to Russia is far more existential than it is for the US and Europe.
So everybody here with the formula is everybody is loser.
Yes.
Andre, I would like to ask you how people inside Russia feel about the war with Ukraine. Is there an internal opposition to that war, or are the Russians united behind Putin and this decision?
Let me start with saying that, of course, there is a natural trend to rally around the flag. And if you look at the most recent opinion polls, you'll see that the popularity of President Putin has increased by approximately 10–12%. I would also say that the Russian leadership is trying to sell its narrative to the Russian public, which suggests that the West is against Russia. No matter what Russia does or what Russia does not do, sanctions will be there. So it doesn't depend on the Russian behavior really, but it is just because the West would like to somehow hurt Russia and ideally just to erase Russia from the map of the world. I would also add that if you look at this public outrage in the West, not only in the West, but I would say even globally, you'll see that a lot of this outrage was directed not just against the Russian leadership, but against Russians in general. Many Russian students and people of culture and scholars and tourists found that they were not welcomed. That definitely helps to sell the official narrative that the world is against us, all of us, not just against the Russian leadership. However, of course,
Andre, even the cats.
Even the cats, even the cats, but also Tchaikovsky, Dostoevsky, and others who can be associated with the Russian culture or Russian history. But of course, the big issue is to what extent these current public moods are sustainable. And my take is more or less trivial. The longer the conflict lasts, the more expensive it is for Russia in terms of blood and treasure, the more collateral damage it inflicts on the civilian population of Ukraine, the higher the chances are that this support might erode. We don't know when, we don't know how, but I think it would be difficult to sustain it if the conflict turns out to be protracted.
I see. Cliff, how do you see the possibility of the war expanding beyond Ukraine's borders, or even the outbreak of a third world war or even a nuclear war?
Beyond Russia's borders, it gets down to what's in Mr. Putin's mind, which we've all become sort of pop psychiatrists in trying to read, not very successfully. I worry most about Moldova because there's no security guarantee, and a potential land bridge across the south would run right into Moldova. Moldova's sovereignty. I think this is mostly about Ukraine for Mr. Putin. Having heard what he's been saying for the last 20 years, how he thinks about Ukraine as really his, not an independent country. So I think as far as Russians' direct policy goes, though, Andrei is the expert here too, I think there's a lot of over worry. I don't see Mr. Putin going after the Baltics, but then I didn't see Mr. Putin doing this. But that still remains my view that the region he's not likely to try to reconstitute the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, in my view. The broader issue is the one I worry about more, and I take the point of Dr. Meyer, our friend from the EU here, that the EU and NATO are being very careful about escalation. And the US is being very careful about it. Everybody's being very careful about escalation. What I worry about the most, as far as my previous comment, which I completely stand by, is the risk of unintended escalation and where this is headed, given passions in this country and Mr. Putin's view of what's his. I really do worry about what has he already said. Just listen to what the president said. Unfortunately, a lot of what he said is actually truer than we thought. That sanctions are a declaration of war. The provision of military assistance is a declaration of war. He must consider US intelligence going to the Ukraine as a declaration of war because it kills Russians. So what I worry about is the risk of unintended escalation, especially along that one border, and maybe in other places, that could lead to a very serious situation. I do think that if we got some of that, both the US and the Russian general staff, at least, would be very careful about preventing further escalation. But I'd like all of our listeners, and there's lots of them here, that shows how important this topic is, to think through what the real stakes are here, because I think they're very high. Well, let me make just as long as one final point here is that I noticed that, first of all, on sanctions, I would point to Venezuela and Iran as examples of where they have been effective, and they can be quite effective. Secondly, both sides made mistakes. There's no question about that. And I, as somebody who's opposed NATO enlargement for 20 years, can easily say that. I think we have to be very careful of moral equivalence in this debate, though. There's only one invasion going on, not an invasion by the United States. In this case, that has been the case in the past. So let me stop there.
No, I mean, it seems that you are pushing him to the corner and you don't give a room for saving his face. For the Russian with all these complicated sanctions, that it might then you remember Saddam Hussein. There was no other way. You didn't give him any other way. So what we are calculating, it will turn to miscalculated by you as invading of Ukraine cliff. Okay, and let me move now to the second theme, which we are talking about the ramifications of Ukraine crisis in Europe, the conflict between major powers and the international order. And I would be back to Andrei and ask him, what are the possible implications of the war in Ukraine for the former Soviet Union republics? Do you think Ukraine's war will push some of these republics into the West Arm, as Georgia has recently voiced its desire to join the European Union, or will a different reaction as these republics may become more afraid of Putin, pushing them to get closer to Moscow?
Well, let me say that, of course, the reaction is mixed. and this is something that we saw in the UN General Assembly voting pattern. There are certain countries around Russia which align with Moscow, and arguably the most graphic example of such alignment is Belarus. I think that Lukashenko really supports Putin in this adventure, and definitely tries to use it to somehow increase his own capitalization in European politics. But let me get back to what Cliff said. He said that he was primarily concerned about countries like Moldova and Georgia. I would say that, in my opinion, the Moldovan President Maya Sandu turned out to be very wise, because on the one hand, she does not compromise the intention of Moldova to get closer to the European Union and even to join the European Union at some juncture. She's committed to reforming the political system of Moldova and to fight corruption and to move in the direction of democracy. But at the same time, she is very careful not to raise the issue of Moldova joining NATO. She doesn't want to irritate Putin too much, and I think that so far she has been quite successful in avoiding a major conflict with Moscow. If you look at Georgia again, I will see some kind of adjustment. Of course, you know, Georgia should be concerned about what's going on in Ukraine. Georgia has long-term relations with Ukraine, and they often aligned with Ukraine in confronting pressures coming from Russia. But at the same time, Georgia did not join the US sanctions in full. And I think that is also a manifestation of the caution that Georgians would like to display in order to avoid negative implications. And finally, let me say that for many countries in Central Asia, at least in my view, Afghanistan is more important than Ukraine. They are much more concerned about potential instability coming from the south, or concerned about potential instability originating from the inside. We saw the events in Kazakhstan just in January, and Russia was fast to summon the CSTO peacekeeping operation there, which of course brought Kazakhstan closer to Moscow. I think that now they will try to keep a certain distance, because some of these countries also have ties to Ukraine, but I don't think that they will challenge the Moscow leadership in the CIS zone directly. I don't think it will happen anytime soon.
Thank you, Andrei. Dr. Stephen, how do you see the future of Russia-Europe relations? Do you think Europe will return to the Cold War with Russia? How will some European countries like France, the UK, perceive Germany's new political and defense doctrine? Will these countries have concern about the new shift in Germany's policy? You are muted, Dr. Stephen, please.
Okay, I will try to answer the question, but allow me two remarks about NATO expansion, because I think this is very important from my point of view. First, from our point of view, NATO doesn't threaten anybody. We had a phase between Russia and NATO where we really tried to intensify cooperation, had also some successes in that. And from our point of view, it's less about NATO weapons threatening Russia. The real threat from our point of view, Putin sees, is a successful democracy in Ukraine and in Georgia, which might undermine his rule in Moscow. That's the threat, and from our point of view, this provokes his reaction. Also, the question, did we guarantee Russia not to expand NATO? There has never been any kind of formal guarantee. The speech Putin referred to in his speech at the Munich Security Conference was made by the German defense minister in 1990. This was before the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, and just referred to East Germany, that NATO wouldn't expand to East Germany. So we don't have any kind of formal agreement on this. Which of course does not mean that there is the perception on the Russian side, but our position and our view on NATO expansion is very different from that. Coming to your question, I'm afraid that we will see at least another 5 or 10 years of confrontational politics in Europe. I don't expect any changes to the situation we have right now quite soon, even if Russia is able to occupy Ukraine and to control it. We will go through another phase of confrontation, hopefully not that long as the Cold War lasted, but we will go through a period of time. This might be difficult for the European Union, but also for Russia, but it's really hard to see an alternative to that. How do the European neighbors see the German military buildup? I think we don't have a new doctrine. We are just discussing whether we should have, for the first time, a national security strategy in Germany. We are working on that. We might see it by the end of this year. Whether this defines a real doctrine, I would doubt it. But certainly we will increase our defense spending in the next years significantly. There will be a one-time investment of 100 billion euro this year, in the next years. And we will increase military spending year by year by 50%. This is a significant increase. It's close to the 2% goal NATO defined. So far, what we get from our neighbors, they don't seem to be concerned about that. At least is what we heard from the Polish government and what we hear from the Polish government and the French government. I don't know whether this might change, but for the time being, they encourage us, so to speak, to invest more in the military spending, but difficult to predict whether this will be the case in 4 or 5 years' time.
Yeah, but does it mean that if this crisis ends, I will go back to the normal?
It depends very much what the situation we will then have globally, because we will also see that the Ukraine or the invasion of Russia in Ukraine is now the immediate military challenge. But we also see crises around the world globally. We know that in the present condition, German military forces are neither able to deter any kind of military aggression, nor to engage in peacekeeping, peace enforcement exercises around the world. So it's certainly the case that major investment in our military capabilities and capacities is more than necessary.
Yeah, we saw Denmark also increasing their military budget. So I think we are going to have the arm racing. It started by that, and nobody will go back where it is to, especially with the more crisis in the world. And anyhow, I move to Dr. Fandakli and ask him, as someone deeply engaged in the US China competition, do you think Ukraine's crisis will promote the rapprochement between Russia and China? You mentioned that in terms of economy, in the light of two powers, the recent announcement of partnership without borders, or the opposite will hold true? Can the US face Russia and China together?
Well, as far as U.S.-China or U.S.-China-Russia combination, the U.S. military has always designed its plans, its positions, and and its strategy on the idea of being able to fight two wars at one time. But that strategy was not based on having two nuclear powers facing the United States, and therefore that strategy is highly unlikely to happen. But having said that, I think the chances of a U.S.-China confrontation is unlikely to be to happen anytime in the near future. People have described Russia-China closer work and closer relationship as an alliance. I think it's a far-fetched idea to call it an alliance, although there's more increased convergence of interest of the two countries, and that convergence is partly political, but it's also partly economic. There's a big difference between the Russian approach to dealing with these conflicts and the Chinese approach. Russia tends to be a singular decision focused on the personality of President Putin, maybe and some of his very close advisors, while China, despite being depicted in the personality of President Xi Jinping, China tends to be much more of a collective type decision-making process. So it's highly unlikely that one person or a small number of people will make that decision. It's much more diffuse, and there's a large consultative process in the making. Second is that there's a difference in China's approach to decision-making as compared to Russia. At least on the surface, Russia tends to be more impulsive, more reactive as compared to China, which is much more focused, much more strategic, and much more long-term. So it's highly unlikely, for example, that China will take advantage of U.S. preoccupation with Russia in a conflict that could extend for several years. It's highly unlikely that China, for example, will opportunistically move into Taiwan or do something so drastic as to compel a U.S. reaction to this. So that's one thing. Second is that China is quite happy. Maybe that's not the right way to say it, but they're quite comfortable and happy to see the situation developing as they have. First, U.S. preoccupation with China, and responding to your question, U.S. doesn't want to have two active conflicts at the same time. They're quite happy that the U.S. attention has been diverted away from China, and therefore they're no longer the focus of more active U.S. political or economic or other strategies. Second is that they're a big beneficiary of this. First, they are able now to secure a very large amount of oil and gas for their growing economy at probably a much bigger discount to market prices because of Russia's needs to and reliance on China now than they would have been otherwise. They are getting quite a bit. They also probably, because of these sanctions that prevent Europe from selling technology and industrial products and other product services to Russia, they would become the primary supplier of that. So that's $150 billion worth of trade that they would have otherwise not been able to get because Russia was using it from that, from Europe. So my point is that China has a very different decision-making. It's unlikely to elevate and escalate the situation they could have done, and therefore it's an unlikely scenario that there will be a Russia-China military relationship. The economic relationship is getting tighter. But as you probably know, there's a history of mistrust between China and Russia, and that continues to the day. For the time being, it's being buried and hidden from view, in view of the convergence of interest, at least for the next several years. It's it's the enemy of my enemy type situation.
Thank you, Hani. Andre, I would like to ask you about how do you see the future of Russia-Europe relation, and do you think that that invasion of Ukraine was it towards a message towards NATO, towards US or Europe? Russia wanted to send message to whom?
First of all, let me say that this crisis will have long-term implications for Russia's relations with Europe and the United States, no matter how this crisis ends. Definitely, Europe will look for alternative sources of commodities, which it now gets from Russia. I think that even if the crisis is resolved before too long, some sanctions will be there to stay. I think many of the proposals that both the United States and NATO were ready to discuss with Russia prior to this conflict might be off the table. But at the same time, I think both sides are interested in preserving some level of communications and some level of even cooperation. For instance, I do believe that we could probably segregate the strategic arms control from the current crisis and continue US-Russian negotiations on the post-New START agenda in arms control. There is some room, if the crisis is not going to be too protracted, there is some room to get back to institutions like OSCE, and maybe to sub-regional arrangements in the Arctic or in other parts of Europe. But all these will be very complicated. I think all these will be difficult, at least as long as we have the current leadership in charge in the Kremlin, because there is no trust. And I don't think that this trust can be restored. On top of that, let me say that Europe will be affected by the major inflow of refugees from Ukraine, and that might change the political landscape in some of the European countries, because we are talking about millions of people. I think that it will also have an impact on the humanitarian connections between Russia and Europe. And these connections will be seriously curtailed. Definitely, economically, Russia would move further east. It will further develop its economic cooperation with China, maybe with some other Asian neighbors, which are not likely to enter the Western sanctions regime against Moscow. So I think that we have no reasons to be optimistic, at least for the immediate future and maybe for midterm future. Things change, and maybe in a couple of years from now, some of the communication lines will be restored and cooperation will proceed. But right now, we will have to live through a period of negative trends, and to reverse these trends will be quite complicated.
Cliff, do you think that US will support NATO's expansion eastward, particularly with demands from some countries like Finland and Sweden to join the pact? And what is the potential US strategy towards Russia?
I think there's not immediately, but I think medium term, short to medium term, there's a good chance that Finland and Sweden are on their way to joining NATO. I think the US still believes that it's the sovereign right of every country to decide their own security future. I worry less about those two than I do about any country in the post-Soviet space, where I think it would be very, very dangerous geopolitically for those countries to try to exceed. I broadly agree with Andre. I fear that he's marginally too optimistic, in my view. I think strategic arms control, I think we're back to, hopefully, I would say, kind of a Cold War type setting where the two sides are able to compartmentalize arms control. away from the geopolitical tensions of the moment, nuclear arms control anyway. We have the climate, we have pandemic, we have terrorism, we have so many things that could, in a perfect world, should be addressed by Russia and the United States. I fear that as long as the current Russian government is the Russian government, those are going to become very difficult. It's really changing. Let me say that things Andre said at the beginning, I completely agree with, that Russians are being discriminated against, at least in this country, to an extent that is wrong. It's just wrong, because they're not responsible for what's going on. But I think that the mood in the Congress and the mood in the administration are really of one mind right now, which is that Russia should be contained. Containment is a word that's used, and that there's very little that can be done beyond maybe strategic arms control, in my view, for the foreseeable future. So I leave it there.
Cliff, if Trump was there, so the reaction, if Trump, because this happened while Trump is there, reaction will be different? U.S. reaction?
I don't think so. And, it's a good question, because if the election were held today, I think Trump would win easily, which is something that people in the region should think about. Look, U.S. policy towards Russia in reality was quite hardline towards Trump. Trump did his thing with Putin, which I don't think I'll ever understand. But sanctions mounted, and the bureaucracy's policy towards Russia was quite hardline. Also, my view of Trump is he'll say whatever sells, and to his base right now, the only thing that would sell would be a harder line on Russia. So I don't think there'd be a significant change if Trump won the election in 2024.
Before I move to the last theme, the third, and I have a question for all of you. Now, how will and I will start with Andre, how will the international order look like after the war in Ukraine? Are we going to see a multipolar system compromising the US, China, Russia, and European Union, or bipolar system compromising only the US and China, or unipolar system with more challenges to the US primacy on the international scene?
Well, I think that we can talk about some of the specific impacts of the current crisis on the international system. For instance, it's easy to predict that for the MENA region, you will see a hike in the food prices, because both Russia and Ukraine export a lot of food stock to the region. We will see a significant increase in oil and gas prices, and that will have an impact on the region as well. But speaking of a more general picture, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that that will probably accelerate a trend towards a new bipolarity, because Russia is likely to become more dependent on China in many ways. China is likely to make use of this dependency. It will become stronger, and it can challenge the United States and the rest of the world. On the other hand, we've seen during the crisis that we should not underestimate the integrity of the West alliance. So I don't imagine major strategic splits between the United States and Europe in the immediate future, like something that we almost observed during the Trump years. So the West will be more consolidated. China will definitely gain, because it will gain from the possible crisis. I don't want to talk about that in detail, but I think that some financial crisis in the West is probably looming on the horizon already. We see it in some of the major indicators of Western stock exchanges. So China will gain, the rest will lose, and that would drive the world towards a new bipolarity.
Dr. Meyer, what do you think?
Yeah, I would definitely exclude unipolarity. I think we won't see that in the forthcoming future. But and I think it's very difficult to predict whether we will end up with bipolarity. But certainly, the invasion in Ukraine increased the probability of another bipolarity. I think the interesting question is how it will be shaped. I think despite what we see just now in Ukraine, it will be less determined by military forces. It will be more determined by geo-economic competition, by standard setting and rule setting. But I think the probability of another bipolarity has certainly increased in the past weeks.
Cliff, what is your take?
Well, I think, as you know, I've been writing about bipolarity. I'm trying to get people to read it for a long time. You know, I think we've been in a bipolar world for the last 4 or 5 years, the U.S. and China. This complicates it. It reminds us that Russia, as you know, our academic friends have reminded us, is a persistent power. It punches quite at a high level. I fear that in the medium term, this will lead to a sharper decrease in Russian power because of sanctions and because of its role in the world will decrease, and we'll see even a more direct bipolarity. But what's really interesting to me is that it may be a broader bipolarity. I'm thinking the one I've been writing about, in that it might be more of a block bipolarity, which is, I couldn't hear if Andre thought multi or bipolarity was on in the future. It might have been, did you say bipolarity, Andre, or multi?
Yeah, well, I think that we're likely to see something like, I would call it soft bipolarity with, you know, asymmetrical relations between various centers of power.
Okay. Well, I think we have an asymmetric bipolarity that really goes through the U.S. and China, but I think it's much broader now. And I think for better or for worse, we're heading towards a block bipolarity. Again, it's basically U.S.-China, but it's more of a autocracy versus democracy structure, which is shaping up. A lot of people have written about it. I wish it wasn't heading in that direction. But so I think it will be a bipolarity with two poles, but important middle countries floating around those poles. That's how I would describe it.
Dr. Hani, what do you think?
In terms of where the world is headed after this crisis is over, or how it's resolved, will depend on a number of factors. But I just want to point out some basic economic change in the global world economy that is different this time than in previous crises. The United States has been able to get its way in terms of imposing sanctions and excluding access to the international financial system from countries it was in conflict with or did not like. But it has not faced a situation of this magnitude and this situation. The U.S. has learned or discovered or stumbled upon the idea that they don't need the rest of the world to finance themselves. The United States has been running deficits, fiscal deficits and trade deficits for as far as I could see, maybe the last 30 or 40 years, most of the time. It has discovered that it could finance its deficits by simply printing money. And it all costs you is the printing press, so to speak, because the rest of the world was willing to finance U.S. trade and fiscal deficits by basically holding dollars. As of beginning of this year, there was about $17 trillion of foreign exchange reserves in the world central banks, and an equal amount in public funds managed by the countries outside of the United States, the sovereign wealth funds. You are familiar in the UAE with the number of those that have a huge amount of funds. And this ability to print money freely without repercussions, and at least for the last 15, 20 years, there has not been a major impact on inflation in the United States. I think we're now in a slightly different game. The persistence and the continued pressure that the United States has used in the last at least 20 years, since the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan and things like that, and the sanctions it has imposed on a number of countries, Venezuela, Iran, and others, and now Russia, I think will compel a number of governments to, on a precautionary basis, to divert some of those $30+ trillion in reserves away from the US dollar to just diversify. That will limit the ability of the government, or will make it harder for the US to finance its deficits. While we're all watching oil prices approach $130 per barrel, my studies of the link between oil and commodity prices and the performance of the economy, at least in the United States, has shown a very clear evidence and very strong evidence that every time the real price of oil, measured in, say, $2022, every time it exceeds a certain threshold, which we have now exceeded, the last 6 times since 1972, it was always followed by recession, some deeper, some longer, but it's always been the case in the last 6 times that we are facing a recession, maybe within the next 12 to 18 months. In a situation like this, with rising inflation, the ability of the Federal Reserve to continue to print fiat money and finance its deficits while trying to fight inflation is going to be a major conflict, and it's a Hobson's choice. Raising interest rates and limiting liquidity will aggravate the economic situation, and keeping them where they are, take inflation back to early 1980s levels, but to digits in 20. This is a real situation and a real conflict that we're facing that will limit the ability of the United States to exercise economic power on the rest of the world to follow its leadership. That's why I think unipolarity is up, but bipolarity may be also challenged, and there will be a number of regional players that could step in with some kind of a limited regional role. The JCPOA negotiation with Iran, because of the need for energy and because of the US doesn't want to face a number of these things, it's beginning to look like it's achievable. The recent announcements from the White House and the hints is that we might be getting an agreement sometime in the next week or so, unless some events happen, and it makes difficulty. India's abstention at the UN Security Council could also.
Hani, I have limited time, and I want to move to the third theme. What I guess I mean, it's multipolar rather than unipolar.
Yes.
Now we're moving to the ramification, economic and energy domains, and of course this is your domain, Hani. But I will go to Andre and ask him, how does Russia look at the least unprecedented Western sanctions, which include, for the first time, cutting 9 Russian banks out of the SWIFT financial system, and to what extent will these penalties affect the country? And do you think these sanctions will remain in place only with the war in Ukraine going on, or will they remain in place for longer?
Well, let me say that, of course, the Russian economy will suffer because of sanctions, and this price will gradually go up because some sanctions are clearly delayed in time, and their impact will be felt not now, but in half a year or in a year or even later. But I think that the burden of the sanctions will not be evenly distributed among the population of the Russian Federation. And definitely the middle class will be the first to suffer because the middle class is already used to more or less Western consumption patterns. and these patterns are not going to be sustainable, the middle class is also likely to be hit by the growing unemployment. If you take blue collars, if you take people who live outside of large metropolitan areas, in small towns, in rural areas, I think for them the impact of sanctions will be less dramatic. In terms of sustainability of sanctions, of course, to some extent it depends on how fast the conflict can be resolved and on what terms. But I think that some sanctions will be there to stay. Maybe a lot of them will be there to stay, even if the conflict is resolved this or that way. And on top of that, what bothers me probably more than direct sanctions is that Russia will get more and more marginalized in the global economy, in the global financial system, and within global technological chains. I think this is a long-term impact of what's going on right now, and this impact will probably go beyond the current political cycle in Russia, which makes me worry about the future of the country. Of course, Russia will try to compensate by relying on China, but there are limits on what China is ready or is willing to do for Russia.
But do you think, Andrei, that the Russia's oil exports will continue to reach world energy markets, or will they penalize in the future? What do you think about the OPEC Plus agreement? Will the agreement collapse under the US and Russia?
I think it will be difficult to take Russian oil off the global market, at least in the immediate future. And the United States demonstrates a degree of prudence in enforcing sanctions on the Russian energy sector. So I don't think it will happen tomorrow. Likewise, Europe is not likely to stop buying the Russian gas tomorrow, but I think gradually the West will try to reduce its dependency on Russian energy sources, and of course that will also be affected by the energy transition to renewables, which will not happen soon, but ultimately will have an impact on oil, on all of the oil-producing countries, including Russia.
So, Cliff, do you think Russia's energy sector will come under the US sanction regime? And do you think the US will exercise more pressure on the countries like Saudi Arabia, like UAE, to end the OPEC Plus agreement?
Yes. One of the things that I think is fascinating about just the political scientist about what's going on is that politics and markets are driving decision-making, grassroots politics in many ways in the West. That's happened in Europe, it's happened in the United States. There's tremendous pressure here from the Congress and the grassroots level to ban the purchase of Russian oil. And I think the administration is very intent on doing that with the European allies if it can be arranged. Gas is trickier. So I think there will be an attempt. Well, traders are already, for reasons of clearing payment, shying away from buying Russian crude. That might wash out after a while if the fighting subsides. If it doesn't, it won't. But I think there is a real effort, or grassroots effort here. It's more than government per se, but it's going to impact the government to take Russian hydrocarbons off the market. And I think it will have an effect. You have Iran coming back on, you have this game with Venezuela now. There are ways to make it up. So the effect on oil prices will be unclear, or maybe not that much. The final thing I'd say is there is a lot of pressure. This is going to build on Saudi and the UAE to get rid of OPEC Plus or violate OPEC Plus. As gas prices go from $4 to $5, which they seem headed now, I think that's inevitable.
So do you think, okay, as Hani mentioned now about the situation and might be there is a recession, so do you think Biden administration can bear the brunt of rising inflation rates and and high energy prices due to the sanctions on Russia, will this leave an impact on the upcoming US midterm election in June 2022?
Well, Biden's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't, because he either has to suffer with inflation and rising inflation, or he's got to suffer, voter defection because he's weak on Russia. So he's in a box. I think that goes more to the way I think, which is going to be a Republican rout in the Senate and the House. They're going to take both, I think, quite easily. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm so sort of interested, intrigued, and worried about Donald Trump. Because I don't think it's going to be a terribly strong Democratic candidacy if indeed Biden runs. And I think people should start to get their arms around what it would mean as far in terms of JCPOA. I know it's a long time. I know it. People say it's not all that much time. The midterms are upon us, and I think the Republicans are extremely strong.
Thank you. Dr. Stephen, how far will Europe be affected by sanctions imposed on Russia? And what are the alternatives to Russian gas in Europe, as Europeans are dependent on Russia for about 40% of its natural gas supplies? Will Germany stop the $11 billion Nord Stream project, the second project, or will this depend on the development in Ukraine crisis?
The effects on European economies will vary among the economies. We know that especially the Baltic states and parts also of the Middle Eastern European states very much depend on energy supply from Russia, as Germany does. We will try what Andrei Kortunov said, really very much focus on diversifying our energy supply in the next years to come. There will be a strong push for renewable energy, as has been there anyhow because of the energy transition, but we certainly will intensify that. I think the immediate economic effects on countries like Italy and France, which don't have that much on trade with Russia than Germany has, and some other Eastern European countries, will be quite limited. So it will be mostly felt by Germany and our eastern neighbors on that. I don't know whether this might have any significant effect on German politics. I doubt it. At least for the time being, people seem to be willing to accept higher energy prices for the sake of putting pressure on Russia. Whether this will remain so is hard to predict, but as you know, we just had our elections on a national level last year, so there is no election on a national level to come in the next 3 or 4 years. We have some state elections which might be affected by this, but so for the time being, people seem to be willing to take this burden and to accept this burden, but we also will try the best to limit the negative effects on our economy.
Dr. Hani, how will this conflict change the geopolitics of energy? And do you think Middle Eastern will grow in significance in world energy market? And what are your forecasts for the OPEC Plus agreement? And do you think that the sanctions imposed on Moscow? Pardon? And do you think the sanctions imposed on Moscow will impact GCC interest and investment in Russia? And is it possible that GCC countries become a haven for Russian capitals and investments? And this is my last question. Dr. Hani? You are muted, Dr. Hani.
So there are a number of dimensions to the questions.
Can you shorten your
Yes. One, I think the first is that OPEC plus, I think, agreement is no longer necessary, and the Gulf oil producers have benefited already without having to limit supply and distort prices. So I think that's gone, and there's going to be a lot of pressure on them, and maybe to their own benefit, to increase production and supply to the extent that capacity permits. In terms of other geopolitics, you all know about the demand for increasing natural gas supply. The U.S. made that by naming Qatar, for example, as the major non-NATO partner or ally. This is all part of the maneuvering to increase supply. For the time being, supplies are restricted and constrained by the fact that there has been no improvement or no investment in energy, hydrocarbon energy. So that's why I think, in terms of geopolitics, there is going to be a need to increase and improve supplies coming from any source possible, Iran being the most obvious target for that. That's why I said before, JCPOA will likely to be resolved, hopefully within the next week or two. But for the oil producers, I think it's a great opportunity to increase production and increase sale, because the higher oil prices will lead to people accelerating the development of alternative energies, solar energies, electric cars, things of that type, that offset that. And that's typically a trend that happens after an increase in prices. And the longer those prices remain high, the higher possibility of moving faster into non-renewable sources and non-hydrocarbon sources.
Thank you, Dr. Hani. And to conclude, I would like to thank all our excellent speakers in this webinar for their valuable participation and contributions to discussions. Thank you, Dr. Kortanov. Thank you, Cliff Captain and Dr. Stephen Meyer, and my friend, Dr. Hani Fandakli. I would also like to thank the distinguished members of the audience who attended the discussions finally. And before I finish my remarks, I would like to remind everybody of the webinar that the EPC will hold tomorrow exactly at the same time, the war in Ukraine, strategic consequences for the Middle East. This is, if you would like to follow Andre. See you tomorrow. Wa assalamu alaikum. Thanks a lot for all. Thank you.